Close your eyes for a moment and notice something so ordinary, so constant, that you almost never pay attention to it. Your breath. It's there when you wake. It's there when you dream. It's there when you cry, when you laugh, when you pray, when you make love, and when you die. The breath is the very first thing we do when we enter this world and the very last thing we release when we leave it. And yet, how often do we truly live inside of it? For most of us, the breath has become background noise, like the hum of a refrigerator or the ticking of a clock. It happens automatically, and so we forget the miracle behind it. We live our lives chasing goals, worrying about bills, scrolling through endless screens, and rarely pausing to realize that every single moment of our existence is being carried on a fragile thread of breath. But here's the secret that ancient sages, monks, and healers have always known. The breath is not just air entering the lungs. It is the bridge between body and mind, between the seen and the unseen, between our restless thoughts and the stillness we all crave deep inside. When we breathe with awareness, we awaken to life itself. When we ignore it, we drift further from who we truly are. Across the Himalayas, Tibetan monks have guarded a knowledge passed down through centuries. They understand the breath not as a mere biological function, but as a sacred key to healing, resilience, and profound peace. Through simple, disciplined practices, they've shown that the breath can regulate the body, clear the mind, and even shift the very way we perceive suffering. Science only recently is beginning to catch up to what they have practiced for lifetimes. Think about it. Your breath changes with your emotions. When you're anxious, your breathing is shallow. When you're calm, it deepens. When you're angry, it becomes sharp. When you're in love, it softens. And here's the insight. By consciously changing the way we breathe, we can change the way we feel, the way we think, and even the way our bodies heal. But in the chaos of modern life, we've forgotten this truth. We search for peace in distractions, for healing in endless cures, for happiness in possessions. Yet, the simplest doorway back to ourselves has always been here. Inhaling, exhaling, repeating. The breath asks for no belief system, no complicated philosophy, no expensive tool. It asks only for awareness. This journey is about remembering. Remembering what your body already knows. Remembering that each breath can be medicine. Remembering that within you lies a timeless rhythm, one that can ground you when the world spins too fast. One that can restore balance when your mind feels like a storm. In this series, we will walk together through the landscapes of Tibetan breath practices and their modern echoes. You'll see how monks use breath as a tool for healing, how science validates what wisdom traditions preserved, and how you can bring this ancient power into your own daily life. This isn't about complicated rituals or lofty philosophies. It's about reclaiming something you already carry within you. Imagine for a moment, what would life feel like if every breath you took was a reminder of freedom? Freedom from worry, freedom from past regrets, freedom from future anxieties. What if your breath could anchor you in the only place life truly exists? This moment right now. That's the invitation before you, to rediscover the forgotten power of breath. To awaken, not tomorrow, not someday, but with the very next inhale. And as we begin this journey together, let your breath be your guide. Because the key to healing, clarity, and peace has been with you all along, just waiting for you to notice. Have you ever woken up in the morning and felt as though you never slept at all? Your body heavy, your mind cloudy, your spirit dull. You drag yourself through the day, cup after cup of coffee, scrolling through headlines, checking the clock, waiting for energy that never seems to arrive. This is the invisible fog of fatigue, a silent weight pressing down on millions of lives. Fatigue is not always about the hours of sleep we get. It's deeper, more mysterious. It creeps into the body when the mind is restless. It grows heavier when emotions remain unresolved. It builds up when we breathe without awareness, when every inhale is shallow, when every exhale is incomplete. Think of your body as a river. When water flows freely, it nourishes everything in its path. But when it becomes blocked or stagnant, the river loses its clarity, turning into a swamp. The same is true for energy within us. When the breath is shallow and restricted, life force becomes trapped. We feel tired, not just in the body, but in the soul. Tibetan monks often describe fatigue as a veil that covers the natural brightness of the mind. It's not that your spirit lacks energy, it's that your spirit is clouded. The lamp inside you still burns, but the smoke of stress, worry, and neglect hides its light. And one of the simplest ways to clear that smoke is the breath. Science supports this ancient wisdom. When the breath is shallow, oxygen barely reaches the deepest parts of the lungs. Your heart must work harder, your brain receives less fuel, and your nervous system stays trapped in fight or flight mode. No wonder exhaustion lingers. But with mindful breathing, oxygen floods every cell, your heart rate steadies, your brain clears, and the fog begins to lift. Have you noticed how a single deep sigh can shift the way you feel? You've probably done it unconsciously, after a long meeting, a heated argument, or a moment of stress. That sigh is your body's natural attempt to reset itself, to release tension, to remind you that breath is the doorway back to balance. Now imagine, not just sighing occasionally, but consciously guiding your breath in ways that dissolve fatigue before it consumes you. Fatigue is not simply about lacking energy, it's about leaking energy. We leak it through constant worry. We leak it through multitasking that never ends. We leak it through resisting emotions instead of embracing them. Each leak seems small, but over time the reservoir empties. And yet the breath can restore what has been lost. Every mindful inhale is like drawing water from a clear spring. Every slow exhale is like releasing what no longer serves you. Tibetan monks are trained to see fatigue as a teacher, not an enemy. It whispers, slow down, breathe, return to yourself. Instead of numbing it with more caffeine or ignoring it by pushing harder, they lean into it. They listen, and through the breath, they transform it. You don't need to live in a monastery to experience this. Right now, wherever you are, pause for a moment. Take a slow breath in through your nose as if you're filling not just your lungs, but your belly, your ribs, your chest. Hold it gently without strain. Now release it slowly through your mouth like you're exhaling the weight of the day. Do this 3 times and notice the fog begins to thin, your shoulders lower, your chest softens, the world feels a little less heavy. The truth is, fatigue will visit us all, but it doesn't have to control us. It doesn't have to steal our joy, our clarity, our presence. With the breath, we can meet it, understand it, and gently dissolve it. The invisible fog doesn't stand a chance against the ancient rhythm inside you. And once that fog begins to clear, something remarkable happens. Your breath no longer just sustains your body, it awakens your mind. And from here, the path opens to something even greater. Discovering how breath becomes the bridge between the physical and the spiritual, the body and the mind, the seen and the unseen. When the fog of fatigue begins to clear, what remains is a doorway, an opening into a deeper way of living. And if there is one group of people who have walked through that doorway with clarity for centuries, it is the monks of Tibet. High in the Himalayas, where the air is thin and silence is vast, these monks devote their lives to studying not just scriptures, but the very rhythms of the human body and mind. To them, the breath is not just survival, it is sacred wisdom. It is the thread that weaves together health, clarity, and awakening. What makes their wisdom so powerful is its simplicity. No machines, no complicated rituals, no endless striving. Instead, the monks sit, they breathe, they observe. They watch how every inhalation carries the world inward and how every exhalation releases the world back into space. They notice how the breath changes with emotions, with thoughts, with the rising and falling tides of life itself. Their practice is not about escaping reality, it's about touching it more fully. Imagine this. A monk begins his day not with noise or distraction, but with stillness. Before the first rays of the sun, he sits cross-legged, spine tall, eyes soft. He places his attention on the breath, feeling it rise and fall, not forcing it, not controlling it, just allowing. In those moments, nothing is missing. Life is whole. That is the wisdom they embody. The understanding that presence is not something to chase, it's already here, hidden in the breath. But their wisdom goes further. They see the breath as the bridge between body and mind, yes, but also as the bridge between the individual and the universe. Inhaling is receiving life. Exhaling is giving life back. It's a cycle of connection, a reminder that we are never separate from the world around us. Modern science calls it mind-body connection. Monks call it harmony with existence. Different words, same truth. When we breathe consciously, our nervous system relaxes, our immune system strengthens, our mind becomes sharper, and even our heart learns to beat in a more balanced rhythm. This is not philosophy, it's biology awakened by awareness. The monks also teach something profound about suffering. They remind us that pain and struggle are part of the human path, but suffering multiplies when we resist what is. Through the breath, they learn to sit with discomfort, to soften around it, to let it pass like clouds drifting across a vast sky. Instead of drowning in the storm, they breathe until the storm loses power. And here lies their deepest wisdom, that every human being, no matter where they live, what they believe, or how busy their life may be, carries this same tool within them. You don't need robes or mantras or temples to practice it. You only need willingness, to pause, to notice, to breathe. Many people believe the monks live in another world far removed from ordinary struggles. But the truth is they face hunger, loss, illness, and hardship just as we do. The difference is how they meet those challenges. Where we tighten, they soften. Where we resist, they surrender. Where we forget to breathe, they return to it, again and again, until the breath itself becomes their greatest teacher. The wisdom of the monks is not locked away in monasteries. It is a wisdom waiting for us in every inhale, every exhale. It whispers, slow down, come back, you are here, you are alive, and that is enough. As we step deeper into this journey, their guidance becomes clear. If you want to transform your life, start not with the mind, but with the breath. Because once the breath is steady, the mind follows. Once the mind is clear, the heart opens. And once the heart opens, life itself begins to flow in harmony. And so, the question arises, if the monks have preserved this ancient secret, how can we bring it into our modern lives? How can their timeless practices fit into the chaos of cities, deadlines, and daily noise? That is where the story begins to unfold even further. The monks often speak of a hidden force within us. They call it the breath of the sleeping dragon. It's not just a poetic image, it's a living reality resting at the base of your spine, waiting to awaken. Think about it. When you are stressed, your shoulders rise, your chest tightens, and your breath becomes shallow. You feel restless, tired, ungrounded. But when you take a deep, slow breath into your belly, something shifts. The tension softens. The mind grows quieter. A warmth begins to spread from within. This, the monks say, is the dragon stirring. The dragon is not fire-breathing or destructive. It is energy, pure, vital, life-giving energy that lies dormant when we live in disconnection. Most of us, without realizing it, breathe only at the surface. We trap the breath in the chest, never allowing it to sink deeper. And when the breath is shallow, the dragon sleeps. We walk through life half-awake, drained, always searching for strength outside ourselves. The monks discovered that when the dragon breath is awakened, the body begins to repair itself. Not because of magic, but because energy finally flows as it was meant to. Blocked emotions, unexpressed fears, and old stress dissolve. The nervous system calms. The immune system brightens. And suddenly, life no longer feels like a burden. It feels like a river carrying you gently forward. To feel this for yourself, imagine placing one hand on your belly and the other on your heart. Close your eyes. Let the breath drop down deep into the belly. With every inhale, imagine you are filling a great reservoir of strength. With every exhale, imagine releasing the dust, the heaviness, the old fog of fatigue. Slowly, with presence, you begin to notice something. A warmth at the base of your spine, a subtle tingling as if a current is awakening. That is the dragon's breath beginning to rise. There's a story told among the monks of a young disciple who struggled with endless exhaustion. He believed he was weak, cursed with poor health. Day after day, he pushed himself harder, eating herbs, chanting louder, working longer, yet his fatigue only grew. Finally, his teacher said, "You are not weak. You are simply sleeping inside your own body." He taught the boy to sit, place his hands as anchors, and breathe deep into the belly, not for minutes, but for weeks, with patience. And one day the boy felt it, an inner fire awakening, a strength not borrowed from food or rest, but born from within. From that day on, he no longer dragged himself through life, he flowed. This is the gift of the sleeping dragon. Modern science is only beginning to catch up with what the monks have known for centuries. Deep belly breathing activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the body's natural repair mode. It lowers blood pressure, eases tension, and awakens the body's ability to heal itself. What monks describe as the dragon, scientists call vagal activation. Different words, same truth, the power lies in the breath. But here's the secret the monks emphasize: it's not about one deep breath here and there. It's about devotion, consistency, breathing this way every single day until it becomes your natural rhythm. Because the dragon doesn't awaken with force. It awakens with gentleness, with steady presence, with patience. Ask yourself, when was the last time you truly breathed? Not the shallow gasps between meetings or the hurried sighs before bed, but a breath that felt sacred, alive, complete. That kind of breath is rare in our modern lives, and that's why so many of us feel drained, restless, always searching for something we can't name. The monks remind us that the answer is not out there, it is already inside. The sleeping dragon has been waiting for you since birth, waiting for the moment you remember. And every time you slow down, every time you breathe with awareness, every time you bring the air down into your belly, you knock gently on the door of that power. Soon, that power begins to stir. Your sleep grows deeper. Your mornings feel lighter. Your body aches less. Your heart feels more open. And people around you begin to notice. You glow differently. You move differently. You carry a calm strength that cannot be faked. That is the dragon breathing through you. So here lies a simple but profound choice. Will you continue to breathe as the world has taught you, fast, shallow, restless? Or will you breathe as the monks have preserved, slow, deep, sacred, awakening the sleeping dragon within? Because once you awaken this energy, life itself begins to change. And that is where the true journey of healing begins to unfold. The monks often say, how you begin the morning determines the shape of the entire day. Most of us stumble into the day half awake. We grab our phones before we even rise, drown ourselves in coffee, rush through breakfast, or skip it entirely and throw our tired bodies into the noise of the world. But the monks approach the morning as if it were sacred, because it is. It is the bridge between night and day, between stillness and movement, between the inner world and the outer one. Imagine this, a quiet room before the first light of dawn. The air is cool. The sky is just beginning to soften from black to blue. A monk sits cross-legged, his spine tall, his breath steady. He does not rush into the day. He awakens it breath by breath, moment by moment. And here is the ritual they teach, a practice so simple that anyone can do it, yet so powerful that it can transform your mornings completely. First, sit down with both feet flat on the floor or cross-legged if that feels natural. Place your right hand on your belly and your left hand on your heart. Close your eyes and take a slow inhale through your nose, 4 steady counts. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then hold the breath for another 4. And now exhale gently through the mouth for 6 counts. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At the end of the breath, pause for 2 seconds. Silence, stillness, presence. This cycle is repeated 7 times. Why 7? Because 7 is considered the number of completion, of wholeness, of harmony with the natural rhythms of life. Each round of breath is like a wave washing over your body, cleansing it of heaviness, awakening it with lightness. At first, it might feel mechanical, as though you are counting too much or trying too hard. But after a few days, something shifts. The counting fades into rhythm. The rhythm fades into silence, and what remains is energy, alive, flowing, steady. This is the awakening of the sleeping dragon within you. One student once asked his teacher, "Why must I do this every morning? Isn't breathing automatic?" The monk smiled and replied, "Yes, breathing is automatic, but healing is not. Healing requires awareness, and awareness requires practice." In the modern world, we often treat mornings as obstacles to be conquered, something to push through quickly so we can get on with life. But in truth, the morning is life. It sets the tone for everything that follows. If your first act of the day is scrolling through chaos, your mind will carry chaos. But if your first act is breathing with presence, your mind will carry calm. The beauty of this ritual is that it takes less than 5 minutes. 5 minutes to transform exhaustion into vitality. 5 minutes to shift your nervous system from restless to centered. 5 minutes to remember who you are before the world tells you who to be. And something remarkable happens when you commit to it for 21 days. Your sleep deepens. You wake without that familiar weight pressing down on your chest. Your mornings feel lighter. Your energy begins to sustain itself, not from caffeine or willpower, but from a source within you. One man shared his story after practicing this ritual for 3 weeks. He had suffered from chronic fatigue for years. Every morning felt like dragging a heavy stone uphill, but after 21 days of conscious breathing, he noticed something unusual. He woke up before his alarm, not groggy but refreshed. Instead of dread, he felt curiosity. Instead of heaviness, he felt flow. He said, "It was like my body finally remembered how to be alive." And that is the truth. We don't need to learn how to awaken energy. We only need to remember. The monks remind us that everything we are seeking, strength, peace, clarity, has always been within us. The breath is the key that unlocks it. So tomorrow morning, before reaching for your phone, before pouring your coffee, before rushing into the noise, pause. Place your hand on your belly, your hand on your heart, and breathe. Not just to survive, but to awaken. Because when you start your day with sacred breath, the rest of the day begins to arrange itself around that calm center. And suddenly, life feels less like a battle and more like a flow. This is the gift of the morning ritual, the awakening of energy, the returning to yourself, the reminder that every day is a new beginning. And from this beginning, something even deeper starts to unfold. Have you ever noticed that the most powerful moments in life are not always in the action, but in the stillness that surrounds it? The hush of dawn before the world awakens. The quiet pause between 2 sentences when someone truly listens. The moment after laughter when hearts are wide open. In the same way, the breath has its own secret silence. A space hidden between inhaling and exhaling. A doorway, often unnoticed, where the mind can finally let go. When Tibetan monks train their breath, they don't only focus on pulling air in or letting it out. They learn to dwell in that delicate pause, the space that feels like eternity condensed into a heartbeat. In that silence, the body softens, the racing thoughts dissolve, and healing begins not from the outside, but from the very core of your being. Imagine taking a deep breath right now, filling your lungs with fresh air, letting life pour in. And then, before releasing it, simply resting, not forcing, not holding with tension, just resting in the gentle stillness where breath becomes pure presence. Science has discovered something profound here. That pause between breaths, called respiratory sinus arrhythmia, helps reset the nervous system. It lowers the heart rate, calms the vagus nerve, and signals the body that it is safe. It's as if nature herself designed this silence as medicine for the soul. But monks go even deeper. They believe this pause mirrors the mystery of existence itself. Birth is an inhale, death is an exhale, and life, real life, happens in the sacred silence between. When you rest in that space, the fear of rushing, the grip of anxiety, the endless craving of the mind, they all loosen. For a moment, you taste freedom, Not freedom from the world, but freedom within the world. The next time you feel overwhelmed, try this. Breathe in fully. Rest in the silence without rushing to let go. Feel the stillness. Then exhale gently like a soft river flowing back to the ocean. Do this again and again until the silence itself begins to heal you. Because true healing is not about adding more noise, more effort, more struggle. It is about returning to the quiet space where the soul remembers it was never broken. And as we journey forward, something remarkable awaits. If silence between breaths can bring such deep healing, imagine what happens when the rhythm of breath itself transforms into a dance of harmony. That is where our path now leads. As the day slowly folds into night, the world begins to quiet itself. Shadows stretch longer, the sky softens into deep indigo, and the restless hum of life starts to fade. It is here, in this sacred passage between waking and sleeping, that a hidden doorway opens. A doorway to release and to regeneration. For centuries, monks have honored the night as a time not merely for rest, but for renewal of the soul. While the body lies still, the mind can either carry its burdens into sleep or let them go. And the way you breathe before surrendering to the night can shape not only your dreams but your very health. Close your eyes. Take a gentle inhale, not hurried, not strained, just enough to feel the body rise. Then let the exhale carry away the weight of the day, every worry, every regret, every fragment of unfinished thought. With each breath out, you loosen the knots the day has tied around your heart. Monks believe that nighttime breath is a ritual of release. Inhaling light, exhaling shadow, drawing in peace, releasing tension. It is as if each breath is a prayer whispered into the silence of the stars. And when release has softened the body, regeneration begins. The nervous system resets. The immune system strengthens. The mind slips into deeper waves where healing chemicals repair the body at a cellular level. Modern science calls it restoration. The ancients called it returning to the source. But here is the secret most people forget. Sleep is not the only healer. It is the quality of the breath before sleep that opens the gate to profound renewal. If the mind is tangled in worry, even long hours of sleep may not refresh you. But if the mind is unburdened by the ritual of breath, even a short rest becomes deeply nourishing. So tonight, before you drift into dreams, try this simple practice. Lie down comfortably. Place one hand on your chest, the other on your belly. Breathe slowly, letting the belly rise first, then the chest. Exhale fully as though you are releasing not only air but the heavy pages of the day. Do this again and again until your body no longer clings to anything. In this ritual, sleep becomes more than escape. It becomes transformation. Your breath becomes the bridge from weariness to renewal, from chaos to harmony. And as you awaken in the morning, something inside you will feel different. Lighter, stronger, freer. Because every night you practice release, you make space for the miracle of regeneration. Now, imagine this. If the night offers such profound renewal, what wisdom lies hidden in the rhythm of living itself? That is the secret we are about to uncover next. For all the wisdom of breathing practices, their power only comes alive when we see them woven into real lives. Stories are the vessels that carry knowledge from the abstract into the beating heart of experience. And tonight, let me share with you a few tales, simple, human, unforgettable, that reveal how breath can transform. There was once an elderly monk who lived high in the Himalayas. He was known for his radiant energy, though his body was frail and thin. Pilgrims would often ask him, "Master, how do you keep such vitality at your age?" The monk would smile softly and reply with just 3 words, "I breathe well." For him, every inhale was not just oxygen, it was gratitude. Every exhale was not just carbon dioxide, it was surrender. And in that gentle rhythm, his body found strength where others expected weakness. Now, let's step into a different scene. A young woman in the city, struggling with endless anxiety, deadlines at work, messages piling up, nights spent staring at the ceiling in exhaustion. She once stumbled upon a breathing practice shared online. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 6. Skeptical at first, she tried it. and to her surprise, within minutes, the storm in her chest began to ease. She wrote in her journal later, "It felt like finding an anchor in the middle of a storm." Breath didn't erase her problems, but it gave her the strength to face them. And then there is the story of a soldier returning home, carrying invisible wounds of war. Nightmares, sudden bursts of anger, silence that swallowed him whole. Traditional therapy helped, but what touched him most was when a meditation teacher taught him to pause and simply listen to the silence between his breaths. In that silence, he felt something he hadn't in years: safety. It was as though the body finally whispered to him, "You are home." Over time, his breath became his medicine, stitching together the torn fabric of his soul. These are not tales of miracles, but of ordinary lives transformed by something so simple, so often overlooked. And perhaps you too have moments where your breath has carried you through. Think back, times of heartbreak, of fear, of joy so overwhelming you gasped. Your breath was always there, steady, patient, waiting for you to notice its power. So how can you apply this in your own life? Here are a few practical ways. When you wake, begin the day with 3 deep belly breaths, setting the tone for clarity. During stress, practice slow exhalations longer than your inhalations. This tells the body it is safe. At night before sleep, use breath to release the clutter of the day, just as the monks do. And most importantly, weave awareness of breathing into the tiny moments, waiting at a red light, standing in line, walking down the street. In each of these moments, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. Breath is no longer background. It becomes the guiding thread of a more conscious life. And as you start to live this way, you may begin to notice something deeper. A quiet rhythm within you that aligns not only your body but your very spirit with the harmony of the universe itself. And that leads us to a revelation waiting just ahead. Breathing practices mean little if they remain locked away in temples or tucked into the quiet corners of meditation rooms. Their true power unfolds when they become part of the ordinary rhythm of living, woven into the very fabric of your daily life. Think of your day as a tapestry. Each thread, each color, each pattern represents a choice, a thought, a moment. Now imagine if every thread carried the softness of mindful breath. The fabric of your life would feel lighter, stronger, more radiant. Let's start with the morning. Instead of rushing from bed to screen, pause for a single breath. One inhale to welcome the day, one exhale to release the heaviness of sleep. This tiny act reshapes how you step into the hours ahead. Suddenly, you are not a prisoner of time, you are the master of presence. During the rush of the day, moments of stress will come. The meeting that drags, the traffic that never moves, the conversation that stings. But here is your secret weapon: awareness of breath. A slow inhale anchors you. A longer exhale softens you. In just a few seconds, you shift from being swept away by stress to standing firmly within yourself. And what about the quiet moments? The walk to the kitchen, the pause before answering a call, the seconds waiting for water to boil. These are the hidden treasures of daily life. If you breathe with awareness in these spaces, life no longer feels like a blur. It becomes a sequence of living meditations, simple, beautiful, real. Even in conversations, breath changes everything. A mindful inhale before speaking allows words to flow with kindness. A gentle exhale while listening makes room for true understanding. What would our relationships look like if every exchange carried the rhythm of breath? Perhaps lighter, perhaps deeper, certainly more human. And then, as evening comes, the ritual continues. Breath helps you release the day just as the tide surrenders to the shore. You no longer collapse into sleep exhausted, but instead glide into it with intention, ready to regenerate. This is how breath integrates, not as something separate from life, but as the silent thread running through it all. It doesn't demand hours of your time or a retreat to distant mountains. It only asks for your awareness, again and again, in the ordinary moments where life is truly lived. And as days turn into weeks and weeks into months, you'll notice something extraordinary. Stress no longer owns you. Fatigue no longer defines you. Instead, a quiet strength, a grounded clarity, and a gentle joy begin to fill your being. This is not theory. This is the lived reality of those who allow breath to become their companion, their teacher, their healer. And as we step toward the final part of this journey, one last chapter remains, an invitation, a reminder, a return to the essence of it all. And so we arrive here at the quiet closing of our journey, not an ending but a gentle return, like a river flowing back to the sea, like a breath returning to its source. From the first inhale of the morning to the final exhale of the night, breath has always been with you. Through fatigue, through silence, through ritual, through stories and practice, it has guided you, healed you, reminded you of what is essential. And now, as you stand here with this wisdom alive in your heart, you may realize something profound. You were never far from it. The sacred breath has always been home. Think of how many years we lived chasing peace outside ourselves, through success, through possessions, through recognition. Yet all along the key has been right beneath our nose, a rhythm so simple, so intimate, so overlooked that we forget its divinity. The monks knew it, the sages whispered it, and now you know it too. Every inhale is a gift, every exhale a letting go, each pause between them a sacred silence where life itself speaks. This is not just breathing. It is prayer without words, meditation without effort, healing without struggle. And here lies the great secret. You don't need to escape your life to touch the sacred. You only need to breathe with awareness, and suddenly every place becomes a temple, every moment becomes holy ground. So when you wake tomorrow, place your hand on your heart, take one conscious breath, and remember, you are alive, and that is enough. When challenges come, let your breath be your anchor. When joy arrives, let your breath expand it. And when the day ends, release it all with a breath of surrender, returning to stillness, returning to peace. This is the way of the sacred breath. Not something to practice and then forget, but something to live. A companion for every step, a light for every shadow, a home you can return to again and again. And perhaps one day, when your final breath arrives, it too will not be an end, but simply a return home into the vast silence from which all life begins. So breathe, my friend. Breathe fully. Breathe deeply. Breathe as though every moment is sacred, because it is. And let this journey never truly end, but continue with every inhale and every exhale for as long as you live. If this journey touched your heart, if you felt even a whisper of peace through these words, carry it with you. And when you're ready, share it with someone who might be longing for the same stillness. If you'd like to continue walking this path together, I invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Here, you will always find not just teachings, but reminders of who you truly are beneath the noise of the world. Leave your reflection in the comments. Even a single breath of truth can inspire another soul. And if this message resonated, let it ripple outward. Because when even one person breathes with awareness, the world becomes a little lighter, a little kinder, a little more awake. Until we meet again, may your breath be your teacher, your anchor, your companion. And may you always remember, peace is not far away. It is right here in the sacred breath you carry within.